but the kind of post-World War II recreation of a number of constitutions in Europe, which was forced as a result of the war, clearly didn't seem to. There isn't really a constitutional moment in the U.S. for that. And then, of course, the fall of the wall being the beginning of the neo or retro moment that we're questioning, 1990 to 2010, also didn't have the same implications, possibly, in the United States, at least structurally, right? So we don't have the same structural turning points. Instead, in the United States, we tend to look at it through the lens of doctrinal turning points that are viewed as constitutional moments, but they also fall at these different times. So there's the there's the structural constitutional transformation of the Civil War amendments, there's the structural doctrinal transformation of the Lochner period, there is the civil rights movement and the resulting incorporation. So those are just simply different time periods and also different modes of change, since one of them is an amendment process, one of them is, and then the other two are primarily doctrinal changes. So the only important structural change over the 20th century that I could think of had to do with the 1988 amendment to the way in which the Supreme Court selects cases. And there's a lot of debate, but now I think it's purely coincidental that it would happen at about the time of the fall of the wall. I don't think there was any relationship there. And although, I don't know, maybe somebody can contradict me, but I think it's purely coincidental. And there's a lot of debate as to how much of an effect it had on the decline in the number of cases. And of course, in our area of interest, it didn't have any effect because it didn't affect criminal cases, only civil cases, resulting in the fact that actually, if anything, the drop in the docket has rendered our area more prominent in Supreme Court adjudication as a percentage of all of those other cases. All right. At the same time, though, there were such large political transformations occurring around 1990 and around the fall of the wall that it's hard to imagine. It was just hard for me to imagine that there wouldn't be an effect here. And so some of the larger transformations, of course, have to do with the geopolitical situation, with the United States becoming a possible single superpower with competing possible other powers such as China or some of the BRIC countries eventually, but nevertheless not being in a dual superpower world anymore. The rise of neoliberal thought, or the rise of a particular form of economic liberalism, having its effects in terms of IMF, World Bank, and development in general. Of course, the military interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, which were related in some way to those Supreme Court cases that we've discussed a little bit, but also gave rise to notions of a presidential or an imperial presidency, imperial presidential powers that have been kind of defended by some and attacked by others. And huge changes in the criminal justice area with the massive incarceration of those individuals starting in '73, but becoming more prominent in the imagination, or at least in our perceptions, in about 1980s, 1985, 1990. And then, of course, since '91, these dramatic crime drops that I think have also raised the tension or the conflict between, on the one hand, this massive incarceration, and on the other hand, a return to a type of criminal normalcy that predated the 1960s. So, looking at the broad picture, I've come up with a kind of intuition, which I'm testing now. But in part, it's motivated by other work that I'm doing digital security and digital privacy. And what that work is really making me feel is that we have lost a certain conception of privacy that seemed to be a little bit more robust, at least in the late 1960s, or as a result of some of the judicial decisions from the 1960s, to the point where today the kind of digital transparency that we are exposed to, forced to accept, seem astonishingly not to raise the kind of privacy interest that I would have expected that they would have raised. So I would have expected more of a privacy response to some of the Edward Snowden revelations than we've seen in the country, in the United States. So that's motivating this paper. And what I've come to the intuition is that there was a form of rhetoric, a discursive form in the post-war period of humanism that was based on a notion of humanist theory that was very strong and robust on the continent and that influenced thought in the United States. And what I feel is that that humanist discourse, and I want to be plain that I'm talking about just a way of talking. I'm not talking about substantive humanism. But that way of talking was dominant and meant that we spoke about protections in terms of human autonomy, human spheres of self-development that had a spiritual dimension to it that was consonant with a more robust idea of privacy. Now, and when I say consonant, again, it's discursively consonant. I mean, I'm not suggesting that it's necessarily logically entailed, but that this idea of the importance of the human in us, which I think was a reaction to the Second World War, meant that we could imagine more easily a spiritual dimension to our humanness that could thrive in the proper environment. And that discourse is what went comfortably with the creation of a right to privacy in cases that we're familiar with in the criminal procedure context. And it went comfortably with the idea that there should be a penumbra of a penumbra protecting human beings so that they could develop under this shade, and a penumbra that included issues of rights to privacy. Now, again, I try to find this in some of the court decisions. It's very easy to find that, of course, in William O. Douglas's opinions, because, I mean, these opinions were odes to kind of the self-development and the flourishing of humanity and the need for privacy in that process. Being in the United States, we do have idiosyncratic developments, and Douglas was an idiosyncratic development. And you know, you read some of the language from, for instance, Papachristou, and you get a clear sense that this is an idiosyncratic development, but it is an ode to the wandering self, the imagination strolling, and the need to develop as a human in that sense. But and I wanted to look at Thurgood Marshall, but having two martial courts. I wasn't going to step in that area, but so I'll leave that as a question mark. Brennan. Okay, yeah. But one does get a sense of this, even not in the not simply in the Douglas opinions, but I think in the whole kind of literature of the penumbra and Katz, etc. One gets this sense that there's almost a million notion of self-development that's important here. Okay. By way of contrast, then, and the change would happen with the rise of more exchange mentality, rational action theory, which takes precedent around the time of during the decades before the fall of the Berlin Wall, really, would be a rise of a much more exchange conception of subjectivity, less spiritual, a market view of subjectivity. Now, let me emphasize. I mean, I really do want to emphasize. I know it was just a joke, but I really do want to emphasize that the humanism was discursive, right? I mean, in other words, as the nice quote from Foucault suggests, who himself was reacting against the humanist, the overwhelming kind of smarmy humanism that was all around him. Everybody was claiming to be a humanist, and McCarthy too would have claimed to be a humanist, not just Stalin and others, right? Okay, but it was a form of discourse that went well with a dimension of spirituality or a dimension that we needed to kind of put ourselves in a particular environment, which I think goes away, or at least doesn't function as well when we have a market view of subjectivity. And so the market view of subjectivity converts most of these goods into commodities, and privacy becomes, in some sense, commodified. And if you can't pay for it, if you can't buy it, then you don't get it necessarily. I think a good example is Gmail, right? Or Gmail and all of our forms of digital communication. Gmail comes on the market 2004. It comes on the market and people want it because you get 1 gigabyte of storage. You get free cloud space on Gmail. Actually, it kind of trades on eBay before it actually exists, and people are actually paying for this. But when it comes on, everybody turns to Gmail because it's a free good. And what did you give away in exchange for that free good? All of your information. So if you have a Gmail account, Google is scanning all of your email, looking at the content, scanning your attachments, doing content analysis, kind of predicting, etc. You have no privacy interest in your Gmail, and the reason, well, this is a market. We're in a market conception of our human exchanges at this point. You're signing on. You're getting a free service, and for that free service, you're essentially paying with a good that is your privacy and your personal information. Now, and so again, one big question becomes, do I want to kind of pick the cases that have this language, which is one way to go, or is there another way to do this? Do I want to actually do content analysis to try and figure out the discursive ways in which we speak in market terms since the 1990s and funnel all of the Supreme Court cases through something like that. But if you kind of pick and choose cases, as I have done here, and I'm not satisfied with, so that's something I would like your input on, you do get a stronger sense that there is a rational actor model that is somewhat more influential post-1990s, post-fall of the wall, and that goes more comfortably with a more restrained notion of privacy. My idea is that in a way, the right to privacy has been privatized, right? And so if you want privacy, for instance, on the internet today, you're going to have to pay for it. And you're going to have to pay for it by getting your own server or finding services that are costly in order to protect your privacy. It's not as if it's a part of a right that we should be ensconced in for, and this is questions of autonomy and privacy, etc. All of those notions that seemed to flourish more, at least in some of those decisions in the 1960s. We are left, in some sense, with privacy as a commodity, right? I mean, unless you're willing to pay for it, it's not going to be yours. I think that there might be some changes ahead, and so it's not clear. I obviously when I saw Riley, I printed it out, and on these long French pages, and the type comes out really funny in French. But yeah, so Riley's an interesting case. I was. We can talk about Riley because I'm not sure that, I'm not sure that this is kind of a robust privacy so much as it's a kind of, the functionality of search incident to arrest is either to protect the cop or to destroy evidence. And, I don't know if this is really so much. And I love Linda Greenhouse's take on it.
The cell phone, it rings for you, right?
Yeah.
That's for whom the bell tolls.
Yeah. Well, all of the way in which she's kind of suggesting that, the justices, if it's something that might affect them, it's going to have a different play in any event. And I can imagine, as I tried to suggest in the conclusion, that Sotomayor might head towards a more humanist discourse that could be more privacy protective. But in any event, that's the intuition. Now, and just as caveats, again, these things go together. I'm not entirely sure what the how the causal arrows work. I don't think that it's because we moved to more neoliberal discourse that there was necessarily a fundamental change. I'm not sure that the level of the rhetoric that we use causes change, but it does seem as if somehow there is a fittingness to privacy protections in a humanist self-development autonomy perspective versus privacy as a commodity in a more market-driven understanding of the world. That they just fit better, okay? And I haven't yet figured out though what the causal arrows are. Okay, so that's the intuition at this point.
Now, yes, Elizabeth, Carol.
Go ahead. Well, I wanted to, of course, draw a parallel to my own area on death penalty law, which I think totally supports your view, and then offer just a small point that I think may help build the connection between privacy and this worldview that you suggest. In the death penalty context, in the 1960s, when the death penalty first really became under scrutiny, both in the society at large and through this constitutional litigation campaign that led to Furman versus Georgia and Gregg versus Georgia, the terms of the debate, both publicly and in the litigation, were very much about human dignity, much more so than today, really in those early years. And the opponents of abolition, the retentionists of capital punishment, really often put themselves in the position of deriding abolitionists as kind of sentimental moralists who would, they'd say, but we need capital punishment, we need it for deterrence. There was all that, the new, Isaac Ehrlich economic analysis of the deterrent effect of capital punishment. So the retentionists were in this position of saying, we need capital punishment for pragmatic, cost-benefit reasons, and you sentimental moralists who talk about morality, you're not paying attention to such practicalities. Over the years, Jordan and I wrote about this, and I can give you cites, but over the years, the discourse has really deliciously flipped in the sense that now, today, opponents are much more likely, I think Phil Holmes was talking about this earlier, to be talking about we need to get rid of the death penalty for practical reasons, process reasons, due process reasons. We need to be smart on crime, not tough on crime. And it's the abolitionists, it's the retentionists who are saying there is no other appropriate moral penalty for the taking of a life other than the death penalty. And it's now the abolitionists who deride the retentionists as sort of sentimental moralists. No price is too high for retributive justice. So that you really see this incredible flip of who's the moral absolutist. So that's just in the death penalty context. I do think that the way that privacy fits into why privacy has declined has to do doctrinally a lot with the third-party doctrine. So the court itself from the 1960s on in Katz, the big case that talked about people having reasonable expectations of privacy vis-a-vis the government, the court said kind of offhandedly, but then really built a whole doctrine around it. Of course, what people knowingly expose to the public, they have no right against the government. And then it turns out that knowingly exposing to the public includes in the marketplace. And that third-party doctrine, which was really meant just as a caveat on the initial recognition of privacy rights, has been the big driver of the cutting back on privacy. So the court initially tied it to the market by tying it to what you give or show voluntarily to other.
What is the case for the
Katz versus United
yes,
States.
yes. You mean the third party
Smith
doctrine?
against Merrill.
Right. What's that?
Merrill against Smith. Third party.
Well, they cite to
They
Katz
cite
where
to
they
Katz,
say
that's
what
right.
people
Yep.
knowingly exposed to the public. That's where they first announced that.
Right, although, so, I'm just, is that the market though, or is that
Well,
something?
Smith, the pen register case is the case where they cite that language from Katz, and they say, well, if you let the phone company
Right.
know what numbers
Right.
you're calling, you
Right,
have no
yeah.
right for the phone,
Yeah.
for us not, the government not to demand that the phone company tell the government. So they said that's the natural application of this doctrine. You knowingly exposed to the phone company what numbers you're calling, therefore the government has the right to subpoena that information from the phone company.
Mhm.
And that whole set of cases, but see, I actually think they've got to change that, and they are changing it. And I think Jones and Riley, of all the areas in which the court is moving in the other direction, it's Fourth Amendment privacy. So, so I feel like this piece might be anachronistic before the ink is even dry. So you might want to think about that, because I'd say this trend is reversing itself vis-a-vis technology, and that this has really been driven by technological change that's associated with the third-party doctrine that's led to these huge innovations. And also, I love your starting with Snowden, but I wonder, whose discourse are we talking about? Because you say you're puzzled by the lack of sort of the public response to Snowden. That has very little to do with what the Supreme Court says in its opinions. So is the right text to study the words of Supreme Court opinions, or is it some broader set of public discourses about privacy and humanism? If you're trying to track kind of
Well, that's
something as general as discourse, it always seems odd to me, like my colleague Jeannie Suk does this, but it always makes me uncomfortable to limit her discussion of text to Supreme Court opinions, as if those 9 guys and their 36 clerks, you know, cover the discourse, you know, so much. Because once you start talking about discourse, I kind of feel like before you go down to counting words in Supreme Court opinions, like I would say maybe expand it to, then you can't really count words, but it seems artificial to limit yourself to Supreme Court opinions.
Okay, but, well, I mean, I'm not limiting it to, in the sense that I'm talking about humanist discourse, having post-war humanist discourse, right? Having dominated or been important or, yeah, dominant in the post-war period. But I do want to tie it to the court's jurisprudence on privacy, right? So the question then becomes, you know, how does that dominance of a humanist discourse affect the cases like Griswold and Katz that create these rights to privacy out of whole cloth, right? At least in Griswold, right? So it seems clear that one can't just limit oneself to the way in which the Supreme Court is expressing itself. But the question is whether the way that the Supreme Court is expressing itself is related to the way in which society as a whole is expressing itself. Right? And then it's improbable that the Supreme Court is playing a leadership role in setting in doing this. In other words, in creating the discourse. So then something about larger. So there was a time. I mean, so imagine the story might have been. There was a time when people spoke this way, and it's no longer. It just no longer sounds. It sounds passé now, right? And in the process, the court is reaching these decisions that are in some way consonant with that way of speaking or not. But you know, how does that happen exactly? It's not going to be. Yeah, you're right that it's not going to be by looking at the language of the court that one is going to see these changes. But it has to be the case that the way in which the court is expressing itself is influenced by those larger rhetorical paradigms or something like that, right?
If I may, I mean, first of all, Bernard, I enjoy very much your paper because I thought you had 2 great intuitions, as you put it. I would not tie humanism and privacy because I think that they stand on 2 different discourses. I would suggest that humanism is a European idea, or it comes from Europe, whereas privacy is an American concern. Yes. I think that in order to understand, and you're absolutely true about the rise of humanism, post-war humanism, I totally agree with you on this, but I think that it predates World War II. I think it starts with the concern of the Catholic Church against the so-called doctrine of the totalitarian state. Mussolini, and I think it's in 1928 that the Catholic Church came up with this encyclic, I don't know what you say. Encyclical, yes. That put forward this idea of subsidiarity. The famous idea of subsidiarity that we have now annexed, In fact, it comes from the late 20s, when the Catholic Church, and I don't ask me who was the Pope at that time, I don't remember, but I know absolutely certain on this, that you have the encyclical calling for, hey, wait a minute, the state cannot occupy the whole field. There is a privacy. Maybe the church did not use that word privacy, but it was very close. It came to this doctrine of subsidiarity. You should leave to the people what they can do best at the home level, the home, and the state must not occupy the whole field. And that is totally European. And it was after that, of course, the apex and the fall of the Third Reich, of course, made that doctrine a real success after World War II. And you had this doctrine by Mounier, you had the personnalisme, you had this all this philosophy of that gave a tremendous boost into humanism. And I think this is the trend. This is the trend. And you could say that it was successful eventually. It was successful because the person who carried that doctrine across the island current was John Paul II. I mean, the Pope was more effective in bringing about the fall of communism than, in certain respect, of course, than Ronald Reagan with the Star Wars. Yeah, because John Paul II, I mean, the Pope, really, rose the crowds, across the island curtain by calling to privacy. So we've forgotten that period. We've forgotten that period where, but I am of a generation, Michel too, so we remember those days.
Even older.
Yeah, you are older even, but not that much. But we would remember those days when people on the east of the Iron Curtain had no privacy at all. And you have this beautiful movie, I don't know whether you've seen it, David Desjardins.
Yes.
That's a great movie.
Beautiful movie. That was, so this is for the subsidiarity and the privacy. It was against the state, against Big Brother. In the United States, it's a completely different story, because in the United States, sure, you have a concern for privacy against the private people, against the peekaboo people, the people who look at you and trying to catch pictures, or people who get a picture of you and put it as an advertisement for flour, for whatever, name it, That is a typically American concern. And I think you have this famous article by Warren, Harvard Law Review at the end of the 19th century, Warren, yeah. And that is in a certain trend. But I don't think that the Americans felt the same strong feeling of privacy against the state as the Europeans, because they do not, until recently, because they did not have the same, when you are in the United States, you know that. I mean, the federal government is far away. Now, the neighbor, and getting an eye on what you're doing, and that's another story. So this is why I would not tie, I understand your point, but I would be careful in not tying them too closely, at least at the beginning. At least at the beginning.
So I think though that American privacy debates, I think that you're definitely right that the Warren Brandeis article and was in part a reaction to technology and yellow journalism, etc., that was more oriented towards private interventions in privacy. But that in the 1960s, late 50s and 60s, that the creation of privacy rights, I think, were more tied to a suspicion of the state.
Absolutely, because the United States started to behave like the Soviet Union. So of course, it was for the same
Right, and so
I'm
it's
exaggerating.
kind of government
It was
regulation.
a little
of-
bit the same thing for spying
Right.
reasons. There was an
Right.
obsession of spying.
Yes.
So we had to watch other people that they were doing. So it's exactly like in the Soviet Union.
Right.
If I could pick up quickly at the 1960s in the United States, there is this whole student movement. There was an obsession with privacy because the army was gathering information,
Mhm.
and so the state was interfering with fundamental liberties. There's even a famous Supreme Court case, Laird v. Tatum, where the people complained the army is gathering intelligence against us, and the Supreme Court said you have suffered no harm yet because they haven't used it. It's a technical mootness question or ripeness question. It was not ripe to start the litigation. The army had not understanding that the basic lawsuit should have been the fact that they have it and could use it.
Mhm.
But that's typical. I want to make another comment, if I may, very briefly, and that is jumping to today. And this is purely anecdotal. It's my own amazement at my own students. And that is when I started speaking about the NSA, the gathering of information, the fact that probably the government has every little detail of everybody's life, the students were totally unconcerned. And I said that, but and I also tried to make a general point about not only is it government but private business. I buy a book on Amazon now. Every book on the subject is being advertised to me, or about coffee on Amazon, so now I'm bombarding with coffee. No matter what you do, now I said to them, this may seem harmless, but what if we have a regime that wants to discriminate against X or Y, and then you're on the list? Because there was absolutely no reaction. Now it may be because I'm old enough to, even though I did not live on the other side of the Iron Curtain, to know that part of history. And it also, I know that Vietnam protested the students that were in the government's eye, that I have a totally different reaction to this. So we live in the United States in an era where private data gathering, most of it for commercial purposes, arouses seemingly no reaction whatsoever. And in this sense, for instance, the contrast both to the societal point of view and the law point of view between a country like Germany and the United States is striking. They have much more extensive data protection, they're aware of it. And for some reason it seems that the generation of my students, there's 20-somethings, have no reaction whatsoever.
But
Do
you see-
German 20-somethings care more?
I don't know that many German 20, most of my German acquaintances are older, because they tend to be academics.
Hold on here a second.
Jump in.
Can I just say one thing though? Okay, let me just respond for 1 second before you guys jump in. And just says that, now maybe I'm imagining this, but it strikes me that for those youngsters, our students, who aren't fazed by these disclosures, it seems to me as if there is a sense in which notions of that those earlier notions that one needs to have a cocoon of privacy in order to develop, in order for this million self-development, this 19th century notion of self-development, of human self-development, simply doesn't exist, right? So there is no cocoon around us needed. And that's
They're on
what
Facebook.
My friends know that.
but that strikes me as being related somehow to this notion that to some kind of spiritual humanist notion that you do need this around you. You need to be in a milieu where you can experiment and do foolish things or whatever it is, or just wander, or just be yourself, so that you can flourish, and that part of this, and that it's part of the human essence, that you need this space, and that seems to be lost, right? It's that ethereal thing that what used to necessarily surround us, that was somehow connected to our human essence. Now, that language might or might not be convincing. When I say it, I can say it in a ridiculous way, or I can say it in a meaningful way. But it just doesn't seem to be expressible today in the same way, unless you make those claims and you sound a little bit like you're back in the 20th century
No,
or
I
something.
think Michelle is right when you talk to students about this, and they treat you like the mother who says you need to wear a raincoat. It's like,
Right.
no.
Right, yeah.
I don't know whether you have, I'm certainly not a part of the conversations in the United States, but you hear on the radio conversations of audiophiles talking about how the analog recordings, the ones that captured all the nuances of voice, really cannot possibly be duplicated by digital technology. There is something lost. And in a way, that's your paper is about this, what it sounds like, this move from analog privacy to digital privacy. And I can't get the causal arrows straight, whether it's as we started getting more sophisticated in our discussion of what the bundle of rights that constituted one's persona or bundle of property possibilities that constituted, we started moving away from this sort of heavily politicized, not politicized, but loose speak about spheres, zones, the bedroom, the idea of who one is, the loose talk, or not loose talk, the resonant talk, you would say, of the 60s and 70s. We've moved away from that. Have we moved away from it because we've gotten more sophisticated? In part of our sophistication has been driven by private industry moving in and setting up spot markets for information and giving a lot more texture to our notion of what it is we have to trade or sell. I see that happening, and the discourse in the Supreme Court's opinions just catching up with our, as individuals, our richer notion of what it is that we have and that we want to protect. And part of this is, and Carol's point to you is, that Riley may suggest a move against your point. You don't have to be predictive in terms of where we go. The point that Riley and this recognition of the cloud brings is just that we're going to be sorting out in a much more particularized sense what information remains in people's control and what's not. And the loose talk of Douglas about penumbras and these things, well, that's lost because we've now moved to a world where we split off of the aspects of information to buy and sell. I don't think you have to mourn the loss of analog technology as long as we handle the digital technology right.
Yeah. No, I love that analogy. It's perfect. Like records, right?
Right.
All these people who say that the records sound so much better. You can't get it. You can't. And there's something. It's like you can't put your fingers on it. You don't know what it is, and I don't know if it's true, right? But it's the same thing of human essence. There's almost like musical essence or something like the analog essence, right? Versus digital production. Yeah, no, that's terrific, and that's also helpful. Sorry, I shouldn't be saying that. Yeah, right.
So, let me go back to something that Elizabeth said, and it's really kind of playing around. And like everyone, I think this is terrific. But I want to sort of contest some of the, at least at the point of departure, some of the constructs. So when I think about the sort of the humanistic discourse and development as humans and dignity, these are features that are common to all of us. I mean, we may or may not engage in some aspects or features privately, but it's all common to us. What sits in opposition is individuality. And I'm not convinced that privacy is at risk now more so than before. I don't have a Facebook account, but I understand that you have the ability to restrict it to who sees the items, not everybody in the world. I think our technology may be making it possible for us to engage in these very common features of all of us, much more privately. I think pornography is much more private than today than in 1970s when everybody went to a movie theater. That's what they did to see the pornography. I think the mob, I think the Berkeley protests were not at all private. They were all very public things. I think what was at issue was anonymity. And I think that's where the market is doing its work today. In the Nuremberg laws in 38, one of the first things the Third Reich attempted was to remove bearer bonds. These are bonds that have value to whoever possesses them, no name. And they also wanted to remove anonymity and securities. Really, of course, just identify Jews who disappropriate their wealth. The market fought back against that by making the claim you can't raise the capital you need to generate the war machine unless you allow the market to preserve it with this anonymous function. But what you buy today what you're selling today to Google or whomever is not your privacy. Google doesn't care about your privacy. They don't care about all the things that are common to us that we may or may not do privately. They care about our anonymity. They want to know specifically what's distinctive about your habits, and they want to exploit that for some return. Now, I don't know. I don't have a fully laid out alternative theory for the one that you've proposed. But it does seem to me that you don't want to necessarily, as Elizabeth said, rest too solidly on privacy, especially when there's this really distinctive, especially for human flourishing, right? So those Berkeley students were protesting and developing their personalities, let's say, in a very public, non-private context. But they felt assured that the government didn't have facial recognition technology to identify each one of them and track them down later on. They had no privacy, but a lot of sense of security in their anonymity in the mob, in the crowd. So I'm not sure what's doing the work here. And before you pick, and maybe it's both, and push this other one.
Yeah, right. So I need to think about the relationship between autonomy, privacy, and anonymity that are integrally linked. And humanism, right.
And I think Rick makes a very good point. It's true in Google and the corporations, they don't care about your privacy. What they care about is against what you like.
Okay, but I think here we're just we're using privacy in a different. We're just using privacy in a different way. In other words.
Yeah, but you have to distinguish between the private and the public sector.
Why? I mean,
Because,
Google doesn't care, but it's doing the same harm to me that the government. Suppose they could figure out ways to sell me things that are not good for me because they know enough about me. So in this sense, why is that different than the government knowing in advance and being able to neutralize me when I have a political agenda that is contrary to what they want to do? In other words, if the source of what is taking away what we traditionally called our privacy can use it against us in one way or another.
It's the mechanism. Yes, you can get the same outcome, but Bernard is trying to identify the mechanism.
Well, but my question is privacy only is the conception here of privacy as being in relationship to the state versus, so in other words, and for instance, fake. So the NSA takes all of the Facebook information. That's what the PRISM.
It's interesting. It's not the state necessarily. It's the state. It's Google. It's me. It's everybody in this room. It's privacy. We could define it on any dimension. but you want to have a category that could
Okay.
gracious enough to deal with all of them.
All right, yeah, okay, yeah. So I need to kind of have a what we are giving away may not be properly called privacy only, but it some people could view it as their private life, but it is something about autonomy and anonymity, and I need to kind of figure out those conceptions more clearly.
And they are relational, I think.
Right.
If you and I have a conversation, it's over some system, and you and I know about it, what I've told you is not private, it's that I've hidden it. But if somebody 10 years later reproduces that, you and I may be jolted, right? Why is that? I mean, there's something about the other looking, having the information. I mean, there's all this aspect of the government collecting, or Google collecting, or business collecting information about you, which somehow alters your relationship in a way that in the past did not exist. That's basically what it is. Or I used to send you a little letter, you looked at it, you could keep it, you could throw it out, but now every email I send is in the server of my university. Now, most likely, as my colleague tells me, it doesn't matter that millions of them, you think they're interested in looking at, you're criticizing your dean on this particular day, forget it. No, on the other hand, they haven't. If for some reason I get a crazy vindictive dean who says, I want to go every email that says, that mentions me, 3 years from now, this will come back to haunt me, right? Now, it may seem trivial, but to me, this is it changes social relationships in a way that it affects something that I call the private sphere, my private expectations, or however you want to characterize it.
Right,
I
right.
have a short point on Michel's students, because I think that we are worried in some version of what Elizabeth called the protection vis-a-vis the total state. Okay, so we don't want that the state or the industry knows everything about that. But young people, for instance, my nieces and nephews, they don't agree at all with that. They consider that this protection is anonymity. They want publicity. They want that all their life is on the Facebook. You don't have Facebook, I don't have Facebook, because I'm old. But my niece, she only communicates with the world through Facebook, and she wants that everybody knows everything about her. So that's why they are not worried, because they hate concealment. We want concealment. There's a beautiful article by Tom Nagel about this point of why concealment is important. But explain that to a girl of 19. She wants to be everywhere. So she's against concealment because they don't fear authority anymore, because they want to be known. I want to be unknown.
For now, they want to be known. They lack the sense of
yes.
intertemporality. One of the points that was emerging is
Same reason they tattoo themselves.
it has a lot to do. I was thinking of the tattoos. This is a generation that tattoos itself. And I intend to make billions of dollars setting up a machine that removes tattoos.
Stall off machine.
You will get rich. If you find it.
It's the collection and use. They will provide the information, but particularly in the United States, and I think this is a bit of an artifact of the way we think about our law. There's very little sense of use and retention built into our doctrine, and I think I don't want to claim that that the way our kids think about the world is a reflection of our Fourth Amendment law. But this idea that we're only going to focus on T1, on the collection, is a commonality with both the way our kids are thinking about their information and the way our law regulates it.
All right, I have just been reminded that it's now time to adjourn and to have a toast to privacy. And I think it's a wonderful session. Thank you very much indeed to the organizers. Thank you.
So let's adjourn to Champagne, and